The night my son told me to leave his house, I stood there with my suitcase in my hand and a quiet smile on my face, while inside my heart broke into pieces. He thought he had pushed me into nothingness. But what he never knew was that I carried a secret he could not imagine. A fortune that would one day make him look at me in disbelief. Thank you so much for watching and for giving me your time. It means more than I can say. And before I go on with my story, I would love to know where you are watching from. So please share it with me in the comments below, because I truly want to feel your presence as I speak. That night when my son told me to leave, I carried my bag out of his house without raising my voice, without tears in my eyes, but every step I took felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself wanted to swallow me for the shame of being cast out by the very person I had sacrificed everything for. I kept my head up because I knew if I let it drop, I would crumble. And though my hands trembled against the handle of that small suitcase, I reminded myself that silence is sometimes stronger than words. I wanted to believe that there was still some kindness left in him, some trace of the boy I raised with care. But as the door closed behind me and the cold air met my skin, I realized that chapter of my life had ended, and all I had left was my will to endure and a secret strength that he had overlooked. I should tell you a little about myself so you understand how deeply this moment cut into me, because I was not a woman who ever sat back and asked life for handouts. I was a woman who worked for everything I had, and I mean everything. For 27 years, I woke up before the sun, tied my hair back, and went off to a job that never made me rich, but gave me just enough to keep food on the table and a roof above our heads. I can still remember the smell of the factory floor, the sound of the machines, and the weight of long shifts that stretched far into the night. But I carried it all with pride because I told myself every sore muscle and every sleepless night was building a better life for my son. I gave up vacations, new clothes, and even the smallest luxuries so he could have shoes that fit and books that were not worn out. Because in my heart I believed the sacrifices of a mother would one day be honored with love and respect. I raised him on my own after his father walked out, and I learned quickly that I had to be both soft and strong at the same time. Soft enough to wipe his tears, and strong enough to pay the bills that kept piling up. And through all of that, I never once thought of myself first. I worked through illness, I walked to save bus fare, and I stayed quiet when life felt unfair. Because I believed my reward would be found in seeing him grow into a man with compassion and gratitude. Yet, as I stood outside his house with my bag in hand, I realized all those nights I went hungry so he could eat, all those winters I wore the same coat while he had something new, were nothing but fading memories in my own heart. Because in his mind, they held no value at all. The woman he married never cared to know my story, never once asked about the years I bent my back to give him everything, and instead she only saw me as an extra mouth in her home. Someone to be brushed aside as though I had done nothing. That realization stung more than the cold night air, because it wasn't just my job I had lost, it wasn't just my place to sleep that had been taken. It was the very respect I thought I had earned with a lifetime of sacrifice. I kept walking though, step by step, telling myself that if I survived all those years before, I could survive this too, and deep down I carried a truth that they had no idea existed, a truth that would change everything in time. The day everything shifted began like any other. I walked into work, carrying my lunch in a small brown bag the way I had for nearly 3 decades, greeting the same faces I had seen grow older alongside me, never suspecting that before the sun would set, my life as I knew it would be torn apart. We were called into the break room, the air unusually heavy, and the manager stood there with papers in his hand, reading words that felt cold and rehearsed, telling us the company was downsizing, telling us our years of loyalty were just numbers on a page. My chest tightened as I listened, but I forced myself not to break, because I had seen too many storms in my life to let strangers see my tears. After 27 years of giving them everything, of standing through aching knees and stiff backs, they handed me an envelope and a handshake, nothing more. I walked out of those doors feeling hollow, clutching that thin packet of papers, and I told myself it was not the end. that I just needed time to rest, time to breathe, time to plan what came next. When I reached my son's house, I still believed in family, I still believed in kindness, and I thought perhaps for a little while I could lay my head under his roof, just until I found my footing again. He greeted me with a smile that felt warm enough, and when I explained what had happened, he said I could stay for a few days, and for a moment I felt relief, the kind that makes your shoulders loosen after carrying too much weight for too long. I set my bag down in the corner. I offered to help with cooking, with cleaning, with anything at all, because I never wanted to feel like a burden. And I thought that in his heart he would see me not as a guest, but as a mother who had once given him everything. But everything changed when his wife came home. Her eyes sharp as they fell on me, her lips pressing into a line that spoke louder than words, and before long she made her thoughts known. I can still hear her voice as if it were yesterday, cold and clipped, telling me they were not running a charity, that I had overstayed before I had even begun. And I looked at my son, waiting for him to defend me, waiting for him to remind her of who I was and what I had done. Instead, he dropped his gaze, shrugged his shoulders, and in the quietest tone he could manage, he told me, "Sorry, Mom, but maybe she is right. Maybe it is best if you find somewhere else." In that moment, I felt my breath catch in my throat, because I had faced many kinds of loss in my life, but never had I faced the loss of my own child's loyalty. The room around me blurred, the walls closing in, and yet I forced myself to remain calm, to keep my voice steady, because if there was one thing I would not give them, it was the satisfaction of seeing me break. They gave me 2 days. 2 days to pack the few belongings I had brought, and I moved about quietly, folding my clothes, stacking my things, leaving a thank you note on the table, though my heart was aching with every word. I thought of all the times I had sacrificed so that he could have more, and yet here I was being treated as though I were less than nothing. A shadow passing through the very home I had once helped him build. That night, lying awake on the couch, I stared at the ceiling and felt a storm of emotions I could not name, shame mixing with anger, sorrow mixing with strength. And somewhere deep inside me, a voice whispered that this was not the end, that they had no idea what I carried within me. So when the day came, I lifted my suitcase, walked out into the cold air, and with a steady step, I left behind their rejection, holding close to the truth they could not see. The fortune that rested quietly in my hands, waiting for its moment to rise. I walked away from their door with my suitcase rolling unevenly over the cracks in the pavement. And though my body moved forward, my mind was trapped in memories that clawed at me with every step. I remembered the nights when he was young and sick, and I sat beside his bed with a wet cloth against his forehead, whispering prayers that he would grow strong, never once imagining that the boy who clung to me in fear would one day push me away without a second thought. I remembered the mornings when I worked double shifts, coming home with sore feet and tired eyes, only to find him still asleep, his stomach full from the meal I had skipped so he could eat, and I wondered how those moments of sacrifice had faded from his heart so easily. The weight of the rejection sat on me heavier than the suitcase I carried, and I felt an ache that reached deeper than flesh, because betrayal from strangers wounds you once, but betrayal from your own blood tears at you over and over again. I walked into the night air that was sharp against my skin, and I tried to steady my breathing, because I refused to let myself collapse in the middle of the street like a woman defeated. The stars above seemed cold, indifferent to my pain, and the street lamps stretched my shadow long and thin, making me look smaller than I had ever felt. Inside, though, there was a fire that refused to die, a fire that whispered, "They do not know who you really are. They do not know what you carry. They do not know that this is not the end, but only the beginning." I held on to that thought because it was the only thing that kept my steps steady, the only thing that gave me strength to face the emptiness of the road ahead. When I reached a small room to rent for the night, I sat on the edge of the bed and placed my suitcase by the wall, and in the quiet, I let the tears fall freely, because no one was there to see them, and no one was there to judge. I whispered to myself that they would regret the day they looked at me as though I were nothing, because I was not empty, I was not broken, and I was not helpless. I had built a life with my own hands, and though they thought I had nothing left, I had something greater than they could ever imagine. Something I had kept hidden for years. Something that would one day speak louder than any cruel word they had thrown at me. That night, as I drifted to sleep with my heart still aching, I held on to the quiet strength that lived inside me, knowing the time would come when truth would rise to the surface, and they would see me not as the burden they cast out, but as the woman who stood tall when they thought she would fall. The next morning I rose early, though sleep had barely touched me, and I sat by the window watching the light slowly creep across the sky, thinking of how quickly life can change. How a single sentence from someone you love can push you into an entirely different world. My heart was still heavy, but beneath that weight there was also a clarity I had not felt in years, a reminder that I had endured storms before, and that this one would not destroy me either. I thought about how they looked at me when I walked out of that house, how they probably believed I would run to beg for help, or that I would spend my days lost and broken. But what they did not know was that I had long ago learned never to trust all my security to one place, never to lean too heavily on anyone else's mercy. I had made decisions in silence years earlier, choices that no one had questioned because no one had noticed, and it was those choices that were now my anchor. I remembered the day I signed the papers for the land I sold, land that many dismissed as worthless. Yet I held firm because I knew its true value would show in time, and when it did, I tucked that money away, untouched, unspoken, and unseen. I told no one because I had lived long enough to understand that sometimes the greatest safety lies in secrecy. And though I went to work every day like any other ordinary woman, I carried within me the knowledge that I was not as vulnerable as people assumed. That hidden account, that fortune resting quietly, had become my silent companion. And now, as I faced the sting of betrayal, I knew it was time for that silence to take on a new shape. I sat there in that small rented room, my suitcase at my feet, and I allowed myself to breathe deeply, letting the ache of rejection settle but not consume me, because the truth was I had something my son and his wife could never imagine. Not just the money, but the strength of foresight, the courage to prepare when no one else thought I could. I whispered to myself that dignity is not measured by where you sleep tonight, but by how you rise tomorrow, and I knew I would rise in a way that would make them remember me every time they stepped outside their door. My plan was not to beg for love, nor to plead for acceptance, but to build something so strong and undeniable that even their cold eyes would have no choice but to see me. And with that thought, my heart steadied, my hands stopped trembling, and I began to map out the steps that would carry me forward, knowing the moment of reckoning was closer than they could ever imagine. With the weight of my decision resting quietly in my chest, I left that little room and walked with steady steps toward the bank. The place where my silence had been kept for so many years. And though my heart pounded as I pushed open the glass doors, I reminded myself that this was not the end of my story. This was the beginning of a chapter I had written long before my son ever turned his back on me. I sat across from the clerk, my fingers pressed together to keep them from shaking, and when she pulled up the account and read the numbers aloud, I felt both relief and sorrow flood me at once. Relief because I was safe, and sorrow because the people who should have known me best had treated me as though I were worthless, blind to the strength I carried all along. I walked out with papers folded neatly in my bag, the cool air brushing against my face, and for the first time since that night at my son's house, I allowed myself a faint smile, because I knew now that I was not just surviving, I was preparing to rise higher than they ever imagined. I spent days in thought, planning carefully, moving slowly, because I wanted what came next to be more than comfort for myself. I wanted it to be a statement, a quiet echo that would remind them every time they stepped into the world that I had not been broken, that I had not been erased. I spoke to a lawyer, signed new papers, and walked through a building that stood tall and empty, its walls waiting for a purpose, its rooms waiting for life to fill them, and I knew then that this would be my answer. My fortune was not meant to gather dust in a hidden account. It was meant to breathe, to stand as proof that a woman cast aside could still rise, and give life to something greater than herself. Each night, as I returned to my rented room, I thought of the day I would see my name in gold on the front of that building, shining against the sunlight, and I thought of how my son and his wife would drive past, their eyes catching on those letters, their hearts tightening with the memory of how easily they had dismissed me. I did not want revenge in the form of shouting or curses. No, I wanted the kind that is written in stone, the kind that lingers long after the words of rejection have faded into silence. And so I carried on, day after day, with my quiet strength guiding me, knowing that my dignity would not only return, but would grow into something so visible, so undeniable, that they would never again mistake me for a burden. As the days turned into weeks, I poured myself into the work of bringing that building to life, walking through its halls with architects and workers, running my fingers over walls that were chipped and bare, yet in my eyes already glowing with the warmth of a safe place that would one day stand tall. I listened to the sound of hammers striking, the echo of voices calling out measurements, and each note of progress felt like a balm against the wounds of rejection. Because with every brick laid and every door fitted, I was not just building a shelter. I was rebuilding myself. There were nights when exhaustion pulled at me, when the memory of my son's cold words returned to haunt me. But I would sit with the papers spread across my table, looking at the plans, and whisper to myself that dignity cannot be stolen when you choose to create something that lives beyond the pain. I remember one afternoon standing at the corner of the street, watching the workers raise the new sign, the letters of my name crafted in gold, gleaming under the sunlight as though the heavens themselves had decided to bear witness. My throat tightened, my eyes burned, but I stood still, because I wanted to take in that moment in silence, to mark the transformation from a mother cast aside to a woman who had claimed her power with her own hands. I thought of the countless women I had met over the years, women who had carried burdens alone, women who had been told they were nothing, and I knew this place would belong to them too, a sanctuary born from pain but carrying hope. At night, I would sit by the window, my hands clasped loosely in my lap, and imagine the day my son and his wife would pass by, unaware of what awaited them, and then see those golden letters gleaming boldly, a reminder that the woman they had cast out had risen higher than their shallow judgment could ever reach. I did not crave their apology. I did not hunger for their words, because what I wanted was far greater. I wanted them to understand through their own eyes that I had never been weak, that my silence had never been emptiness, it had been preparation. And with that thought settling into my soul, I knew I had chosen the right path, not of bitterness, but of strength. And that strength was now written into the very walls of a place that would stand long after the sting of betrayal had faded. The first day the shelter opened its doors, I stood quietly at the entrance, my hand resting against the frame, as women and children stepped inside with cautious eyes that slowly softened when they saw the clean beds, the warm lights, and the welcome written into every corner of that place. I felt my chest rise with something I had not felt in years, a sense of purpose deeper than any job could have given me. Because I was no longer just surviving, I was giving life to others who had known what it meant to be turned away. I watched as they settled in, some clutching bags as small as mine had been when I left my son's house, and I thought of how life circles back, how pain can be turned into refuge if you have the strength to rise above it. As the days passed, the building began to hum with a new kind of music, laughter of children bouncing against the walls, soft voices of women sharing stories in the hallways, and the quiet steps of those who finally had somewhere safe to lay their heads. Each sound was a reminder that what my son thought was my downfall had become the root of something greater, something that bore my name but belonged to every soul who entered through those doors. I would walk the halls at night, the glow of the lamps lighting my path, and with every room I passed, I felt my own heart healing. Because while my family had cast me aside, I had found a new family in those who understood the language of struggle and the strength of survival. And then it happened, sooner than I expected, the moment my son and his wife drove past on their way home, their eyes catching on the gold letters shining proudly across the front. I was told later that their car slowed, that silence filled the space between them. And though I was not there to see their faces, I could imagine the shock, the disbelief, the realization settling heavy in their hearts. They had thought they had sent me into nothingness, that I would fade into shadows. Yet now, every time they passed their street, they must see my name carved into stone, a reminder that their rejection had not destroyed me, it had built me. And in that truth, I found a peace I had never known before. A peace born not from their apology, but from the knowledge that I had reclaimed my dignity in a way they could never erase. Not long after the shelter became part of the neighborhood, I began to notice the whispers that followed me whenever I walked down the street. Not whispers of pity as before, but whispers of respect, of admiration, and sometimes in awe, because people could see with their own eyes that I had turned pain into something lasting. Shopkeepers nodded at me with a kind of warmth that had never been there before. Neighbors stopped to greet me with genuine smiles, and the women who came through the shelter began to call me their pillar, their safe place, their proof that life could begin again, even after betrayal. Inside, I carried a strange mix of feelings, because while my heart swelled with gratitude for this newfound honor, there was also a sting each time I thought of how the respect of strangers came more easily than the love of the son I had given everything to. One afternoon, as I was watering the flowers by the entrance, I saw their car pass again, slower this time. The wife's face tight with disbelief, my son's eyes fixed on the sign above the doors, and though they did not stop, I felt the weight of their gaze heavy on my back. For a moment I let myself wonder if he remembered the nights I worked through sickness to keep him clothed, if he remembered the mornings when I held his hand on the way to school, if he remembered the taste of meals that came from my own hunger, and if all those memories now struck him with shame. They had wanted me gone, erased from their lives, yet here I stood, rooted deeper than ever, a presence they could not avoid, no matter how hard they tried to turn their heads. I chose not to chase them, not to call them back, because forgiveness is not something that can be forced, and love is not something that can be begged for when hearts have turned cold. Instead, I poured myself even more into the shelter, into the lives that came through those doors, reminding myself that family is not always defined by blood, but by those who stand beside you when the world has cast you aside. At night, when I locked the doors and turned off the lights, I would walk slowly through the hallways, my footsteps echoing softly, and I would feel peace settle into me like a gentle blanket, because I had found my own redemption, not in their acceptance, but in my decision to keep standing. And with each passing day, the sting of their betrayal lost its sharpness, replaced by the strength of knowing that sometimes the greatest answer to cruelty is not revenge shouted in anger, but a life lived so fully and so proudly that those who cast you out are left staring at what they can never take away. There came a day when he finally gathered the courage to walk through the very doors he had once forced me away from. And I watched him step inside with eyes that carried both pride and shame, his shoulders tense as though the weight of the sign above had pressed down on him before he even crossed the threshold. He looked around at the women gathered in the common room, at the children playing quietly in a corner, at the walls freshly painted and decorated with care, and I could see in his face that he had not expected this. He had not expected me to rise from the ashes he thought he had scattered. For a long moment we stood there in silence, the air thick between us, and I could almost hear the echo of his voice from that night when he told me to leave, the voice that had cut deeper than any knife. But now it trembled inside his chest as he tried to find words. He muttered something about wanting to talk, about not knowing things would turn out this way, and though his voice was low, I could hear the crack in it, the same crack that comes when regret gnaws at a man who thought he was stronger than he truly was. I let him speak, but I did not answer right away, because my heart was steady now, no longer desperate for his approval, no longer reaching for scraps of affection that should have been freely given. When I finally did speak, my words were calm, firm, and clear, telling him that while blood ties us together, respect is what keeps that bond alive, and once respect is broken, it is not easily repaired. I told him I did not build this place to prove anything to him, but to prove to myself that rejection cannot end a life. It can only push it toward a different kind of purpose. He lowered his head then, his eyes darting to the floor, and in that small gesture I saw the boy I once knew. The boy who used to hold my hand with trust. The boy who used to look at me as though I were his whole world. But the years had changed him, and the choices he made had carved a distance between us that no quick apology could erase. I felt sorrow for him, not anger, because I knew he would carry the memory of what he had done longer than I would carry the pain of it. And in that sorrow there was a kind of justice, a quiet balance that needed no shouting, no punishment, only truth. So I stood tall, my hands folded before me, and I let him see with his own eyes that the mother he cast aside had not disappeared, but had become stronger, wiser, and untouchable, leaving him to reckon with the weight of his choices in silence. After he left that day, I sat alone in the quiet of my office, the sound of his footsteps fading down the hall, and I let myself breathe deeply, feeling the weight of years lift from my shoulders in a way I had not expected. I thought about the boy I once raised, the man he had become, and the distance that now stood between us like an ocean. And though part of me ached for what was lost, another part of me understood that life does not always give us the closeness we long for. Sometimes it gives us lessons we never asked to learn. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, remembering the countless nights I had stayed awake worrying about how I would pay bills, how I would keep him clothed, how I would hold our lives together when everything seemed to fall apart. And I realized that I had been strong for so long that I had forgotten what it meant to rest in my own worth. Now in this new chapter, I was no longer living in the shadow of his choices. I was living in the light of my own. The shelter bustled with life. People found safety under its roof. And each smile I saw reminded me that rejection can be turned into something that feeds the soul rather than destroys it. I had built something that would outlive me, something that would carry my name with dignity. And I knew that even if he never truly understood, the world around us had already taken notice. And with that knowledge came peace. The kind of peace that does not come from apologies or reconciliation, but from knowing you stood firm when others tried to break you. I walked the halls again that evening, pausing to watch the children laugh and the women share quiet conversations, and as the sun dipped low and cast golden light across the windows, I felt the warmth of something greater than revenge, greater than anger, greater even than sorrow. It was the warmth of survival, of triumph, of dignity reclaimed. And as I stood there, I whispered to myself that no matter what my son chose to do next, no matter how he carried his guilt or his silence, I had already won in the only way that mattered. My life was not over when he cast me out. It had only just begun, and every brick in these walls was proof that strength can grow even from the deepest wounds. As I closed the doors that night and let the quiet settle around me, I thought of how far I had come from the moment I walked out of my son's house with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart. And I felt no bitterness, only a deep calm that comes when you know you have turned your pain into purpose. I no longer carried the weight of needing his approval. I carried instead the joy of knowing I had built something lasting, something that would stand as proof that no betrayal has the power to define the rest of your life unless you let it. My son may still struggle with the choices he made, but I have chosen peace, I have chosen dignity, and I have chosen to keep walking forward with my head held high, knowing that my strength is written in every brick of this shelter and in every life it touches. Thank you for staying with me through my story. It means so much to share these words with you. And if it touched your heart even a little, please subscribe so we can continue this journey together, and share this story with someone who might need the reminder that strength and dignity can always rise again.